one way, the other hemisphere spins the other way.
Yeah.
That would be, yes, that is with low pressure systems that are solely governed by the Coriolis effect. But I've been told things like sinks, it can be local effects, like which faucet is having more, or the slight directionality to the water is going to impart the spin. But definitely low pressure systems will spin counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere because of the Coriolis effect.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I
and
thought
it's because as they move away or to the equator, the velocity is staying the same. There's sort of a momentum to it, but the Earth is turning underneath at a slightly. They decouple from the Earth just slightly, so they start turning. So I would have to work out to verify that that does give you. Um, no, I said counterclockwise. Excuse me, it's clockwise in the northern hemisphere. Um, because as you move from the equator, let's say you have a body of air moving from, or water moving from the equator with a certain velocity that's because of the spin of the Earth, 25, about 1,000 miles an hour. And then as it's moving northward, it's going to a place on the Earth that is the same angular velocity but less actual velocity as you go to a higher latitude, because the smaller latitude circle, but it's still carrying that 1,000 mile an hour um, velocity with it for a while. The friction's slowing it down. So that is, as the Earth is turning underneath, that's going to put that wind toward the east. So it's going to start it going in this counterclockwise direction. Excuse me, clockwise direction. But that's the reason. Uh,
well, so looking at the water go down the sink was full, and I opened the drain,
oh,
and it just started, whirling, and
was it
it's pretty consistent.
clockwise?
It always goes the same direction. But
Was it
I got to
clockwise?
wondering, is there something going on that makes cycles inherent? The galaxies turn, uh, stars rotate on their axes, planets rotate on their axes, and so on and so forth. And I wonder what was inherently going on that would once
It's the
maybe
gravity
the
well.
whole universe.
It's the gravity well.
Well, but
Gravity
still,
well.
why doesn't something just go straight in the gravity well instead of spinning around? You've seen
Yeah.
those parabolic demos where you put a ball going down and it spins around until it gets down. Anyway,
Yeah.
I don't
So
know.
would we say that the universe as a whole, I think, has to have zero angular momentum. The sum of everything, I think, has to be zero angular momentum. Hillary, does that seem reasonable, or
I think so.
because
Depends.
unless the Big Bang imparted an angular.
Well, yeah.
But I never hear that discussed. You hear the sum, the energy, the sum of the energy is zero.
Mm,
Um, but you can have existence. You can have matter exist as long as the
yes.
sum is zero. So I just was reading why gravity is considered a negative energy. It's because as a planet is there, it would take a lot of energy to pull it apart. There was something I never understood about the zero total energy argument, but I just was reading something that made me think the astrophysicists understand it, even if I didn't fully understand it. But I would think,
I,
but you never hear that. I never hear that discussed for angular
Mm.
for angular velocity.
Well, if you abstract up, if maybe the fact that planets don't just fall into the gravity well, maybe this is evidence that in a greater dimension, the universe is a sphere and it is spinning.
Yeah, maybe. I mean,
What's what?
Tom said the one thing that about that what physicists have told me, that the spin on the quantum level, spin of these fundamental particles, that there's nothing actually spinning. That it's they don't, because they might have zero dimension. It's just that mathematically there is something that is kind of equivalent to angular momentum or velocity. I think you said that, Tom, as you were
Yeah,
looking
I
it up.
copied something out of Wikipedia, and it convinced me that they really were two different things. So that's the way I put it in the model. But it's up for discussion if it's not true.
Yeah, and Len keeps, yeah, well, anyway, but and then the what the fermions have half spin and the bosons have one spin, and things that have integer spin can compact and be together, so you can have photons and a laser. But the things like electrons and quarks that have half spin cannot be in the same quantum state. So that's why the electrons have to be in different shells. And I mean, what the hell is half spin versus full spin? That's why they say it's a mathematical property that works out well for all their theories, but doesn't really have something that we should be imagining as half spin. Because then some of these particles have three half spin if they combine, one half spin, three full spin, half spin. But I was told by Ellen Minzer at NYU that this is not to be imagined as a planet
Right.
spinning.
Yeah, I had somewhere way back when I saw it or read it described using vectors, and and it just has a property like a vector going around, but not actually. There's no body that's spinning.
Yeah, so electrons can still have this up-down thing, almost like a
Mhm.
right-hand rule or left-hand rule. The electrons, because two electrons can be in the same orbital, like the p, the s is two electrons, the p is six, but it's three or suborbitals, two electrons each, because the electrons can be in different orientations. But
Yeah.
what does orientation mean
Yeah,
if there's not actually an object there? But
right.
but but okay, Hillary, yeah.
No, all, all I was going to say is what I said in an email to Len that I think sent him off in the huff, that the problem with quantum mechanics is it is totally counterintuitive. And the only way we have any confidence at all in our understanding is that the maths keeps working. So as far as I remember, you have spin, angular momentum, it's angular momentum quantum numbers of plus half, minus a half for electrons. This is slowly coming back after 40 years.
Yeah.
And that's about all
Yes.
I remember. So
Yes.
I'm often
it's some differentiation of the state that allows two of them to exist in the same orbital. And
Yeah.
the theory
And yet be
manages to
different.
tie stuff together, and that's all we know.
Plus, physicists are known to have a whimsical approach to naming things.
Yeah, and
Get a phenomena.
yeah. Sorry, there's one other thing. I think we did a course on quantum electrodynamics that I almost completely failed to understand. But I think there was something about spin being related to magnetic effects, and if you get all the spins to line up in the same direction, you get a net magnetic moment, I suppose. But that's literally all I can remember now.
I think you're
Tom
right.
can remember more.
I'm frequently impressed with how many things there are to look into, which makes me think about priorities. And I don't prioritize quantum mechanics as something we're all looking into too much. I think you had a statement, Hillary, about you have to go with what it is, but you can't necessarily explain why it is that way.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
At the other end is the cosmos, or we're talking about whether it's expanding or whether it's cycling back and forth, and things like the string theory, or what's the term, multi-universe. And again, I don't see that there's a lot of value in going into that. You should be aware of it, and perhaps something will come up that's important for systems, but it seems like there's such a huge thing in between those two that that's where we should be focusing.
Yeah.
But
I mean, what
something
one?
like disambiguating spin thing, I think that's important so that we don't confuse it.
Yeah. So something else that I've remembered, there's a population dynamics equation. Is it a logistic equation? No, it's not. It's something else. But there's a population dynamic equation that if you model predator-prey dynamics, you get more predators, they eat more prey. Predators keep increasing until the prey population collapses.
Yes.
Then the predator population collapses, and they keep cycling. So there's all sorts of things like that you could argue that's just the way the maths works. Okay, so what that's saying is that cycling is an emergent property of lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of individual agent-to-agent interactions ends up giving you this complex-looking periodic systemic behavior that none of the individual actors know anything about.
There's one of those with, I think it's foxes and rabbits in Canada
Yeah.
over like 30 years, which is amazing.
Yeah, I got some news for you guys. That data was made up. Yes, it did come from, I'm trying to remember the name of the two guys who formulated the math.
Yeah.
But what it was back in the late 1800s, they had collected rabbit fur in one part of Canada, and they collected fox fur in another part of Canada. And somebody noticed that some years there'd be a lot of rabbit furs and not so many fox furs, but they were from two entirely different areas. So somebody was sort of, well, maybe it works this way. Came up with this beautiful equation. And that has been, I learned this from my ecologist mentor at ESF. He pointed out that people have been basing models on that equation forever and ever, assuming that it was absolutely correct. When in fact, it derived from somebody just saying, well, I bet it works this way. A lot of models that we use actually do start out that way.
So there's another cycle, which is the long cycle you get in economics. Is it Kolmogorov, or is that something else altogether? There's something economists talk about the long.
Kondratiev?
Thank you. Yes. Kondratiev. Yeah. Kondratiev, I think.
That's just a business cycle?
Yeah. Which again is presumably some sort of collapse, growth, saturation thing that will just happen with some sort of time constant. I'm not sure there's anything fundamentally systemic about it, but well, I suppose if it's an emergent property of a multi-level system, then I suppose it's about the systemic nature of it, that you can actually generate that property by modeling. You can generate system level property by modeling the subsystem interaction, small scale subsystem interactions to get macroscopic. Whatever. But is that fundamental, or is that just an observation? I don't know.
Oh, the other is Lotka-Volterra was the name of that.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this point that some of the examples Hillary's giving, I've been wondering about cycles that are, let's say, inside a cell that one can argue have some kind of function for the life of that cell and might come into being during the evolution from very simplest cells. As cells get more complex, we might find more cycles, different. I mean, certainly these control cycles of protein loops and things would get more complex. Whether that's fundamentally different from, let's say, the Kondratiev cycle of economics, there would be in ecosystem probably some kind of cyclic, not perfectly cyclic, but some kind of boom bust behavior. I mean, they argue that there are populations can rise and populations can fall. So the question is, for me, do we distinguish the cycles that are the result? I think, Hillary, you were saying, is like small scale interactions. Hey, Lynn.
Hi. I
Uh,
overstepped. Sorry.
versus cycles within a cell that is subject to life-death dynamics of evolution. I wonder if anybody has any thoughts about that.
I've got a couple of things that, one, I want to make sure we understand something. We've lost track of where we started. You know, we're trying to decipher combogenesis and ontogenesis and so forth.
Yeah.
Now we're off on a particular,
Yeah.
what Tyler calls a meta pattern, but, you know, and spending an awful lot of time and energy on that. And I want to re-raise the fact that these are all described by dynamical equations.
Yeah.
And they're not, and if you make room in the model, if the model can actually handle dynamics, then you can program in those dynamical equations and have the simulation actually produce those dynamics.
Yeah.
So are we reinventing, bad metaphor, are we reinventing the wheel? Reinventing the cycle.
Reinventing coupled dynamical equations or something.
I mean,
It concerns me that I agree that there's something there that is a meta pattern, that we find it cycles of some kind universally, but what are we doing by actually spending so much time on it?
What we were doing, we were actually producing something.
Well, okay, possibly, but in terms of the purpose of this particular group, I mean, I did just have another thought, which is it as simple as the existence of the cycle implies the existence of feedback in the system? Is it just that simple? You get cycle when you've got dynamical equations with feedback in them.
Well, if we include things like rotation, real spin, mechanical spin,
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
then I don't see any feedback.
So there's a fundamental difference then between real mechanical spin, which is a property of constant angular momentum, and effectively zero energy transfer as long as there's no friction, with the kind of cycling that we see in dynamic systems, where it's effectively you've got feedback loops and time constant delays and things. So they are completely different.
Well, there's a complication. So the Earth is spinning on its axis.
Yeah.
The moon is pulling tidal waters up and down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the lunar and solar gravitational fields interact, or the interactions is actually a lot of what's been driving biological evolution.
Yeah.
The diurnal cycle, day and night, that determines everything.
Yeah.
So I just don't see it as being simple enough to encapsulate in one concept.
Well, let's be devil's advocate and Occam's razoring then. I did the physicist thing that says if the thing is spinning with no friction, then there's no loss of energy. What you have with the moon and the earth and the sun is a coupled system of three spinning things, one of which is spinning around the second, which together are spinning around the third. And because they're actually exerting force on each other, the frictionless assumption is not correct. So you do have a coupled thing, and so yeah. The reductionist thing says you've got two or three clearly identifiable separable mechanisms that together generate this really, really, really interesting behavior.
So I agree with George.
I think that's what we need to talk about. Can we move on? So, sorry, Gary, you're wanting to actually produce an article about this. Is this helping?
Well, the discussion has been interesting. Yeah, as always. Yeah, but I do agree with George that we do need to get back on track. Um,
Yeah.
Fairly soon. But before we
Yes.
do that, I want to get to a point of completion on that article that I've been putting together, because I think it is important that we start to create these articles on general system concepts to start to map out the landscape. I mean, we're considering the landscape as a whole, and you know, I want to get back to convergenesis and emergence. And that may well be another article that we put together. In fact, there is an article on emergence already in the SE book, and you know, we really ought to review that at some point, I guess. And I know that Tom has been doing some more work on the model, looking at the features and functions of cycles. So I would like to have a look at that as well. If I may, just for 15 minutes to show you the article and to get your impressions on any essential points that need to be changed or included. And Tyler, you know I've set you up for next week. I think it's next week.
It's in, it was in 2 weeks, I think.
Is it 2 weeks? Yeah.
Or 3 weeks even.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll confirm the date, but every Saturday there's what we call a Saturday integration workspace session for the ISSS, and every week there's a speaker, you know, on a particular topic, and then there's sort of like a roundtable discussion of the topic. And I was hoping that you would present on cycles and this conversation we've been having.
Yeah, I've spent actually a number of hours. I reviewed carefully my chapter on cycles to try to pull out the essential points, and I started some notebooking on the cycles from a fresher mind, the current mind of some of the things we've been talking about in this meeting. And I have to say, my head, as I like to use this metaphor, my head started spinning about with the whole thing, because it just goes out forever. I mean, it's just like every system in a sense is cyclic, because the interactions among the parts are form a partial closure. And I know I know there were some people that felt that the cycle is different from feedback, and just because you draw a feedback loop on a diagram doesn't mean it's a cycle. But I can't separate those things. They start merging. You start thinking about control control loops in within a cell, in which the enzymes are affecting each other, and states change and then go back to the state. But it's also because there's sort of positive and negative controls going on. I almost can't separate those things. So you know, I could present something, Gary, but I started concluding the most interesting thing would be, and this is along lines of trying to tie it into some kind of grand sequence of ontogenesis or something, would be to say at major steps in the universe, does something happen with cycles at those stages, rather than trying to take on cycles as a whole phenomenon. Because I started, I think it's really interesting, but I also saw that it was not it was not simple at all. And I kept concluding that the physical chemical world, the world of atoms and electrons going back up and down as they absorb and release energy, and planets, and geological plate tectonics and ocean gyres, and even water. Okay, now water is cycling cycling in changes of state, the water cycle. So there's I thought that you would bin those, and then we would bin the biological cycles, and then the cultural cycles, because the mental part of cycles is really important too. The ability of human beings to model or to make calendars, or to say, to have memory and, memory return.
Mm.
So I wanted to, I know, Gary, you wanted 15 minutes and I'm a little bit rambling here, but you did say you put me on the spot in a few weeks, and I'm happy to do that.
Mm.
But I started thinking about one of the most important cycles would be something that we don't even think exists right now, which would be these hyper cycles of the origin of life, or some kind of proto cell that is our chemical loops. The reason we don't think they exist, we don't know that they exist currently, but they would have given rise to cells through an evolutionary system. And now, how do we regard now? So George might have an opinion about this, that this is fundamentally different from ordinary chemical reactions. When you have a loop, we have a dynamical loop chemical system like that now can do chemical evolution. So in terms of putting it in back to something about the grand sequence, or a grand sequence, or some kind of sequence of steps, pointing out some major. So I'm gonna end, but that the protocell, the key part of this concept of the biochemical origin of life, is the formation of a new kind of cycle
Mm. Mm. Yes.
of loops of molecules that are making each other. They have to have some input and some waste, but like this would be the invention of a new kind of cycle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would be really
Yeah.
important. So there's a tie between the cycle and some kind of sequence.
Yeah.
See, Tom wants to say something. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a lot of similar thoughts to what you just articulated from modeling. So I have cycle as a sort of super type with a bunch of subtypes, and
Mm.
you have to adjust definitions to make it fit and the whole thing be coherent.
Mm.
And as you do that, the cycle definition gets more and more abstract, to the point where you say, does this really mean anything, or it's just this big umbrella term that somehow we put all these things together and they're really quite different.
Yeah, the fundamental thing that I've always thought is that if you can identify state space, if you can characterize the state space, and you can characterize the phase space as the states go around, you said everything there is to say about any cyclical phenomenon you can imagine. As long as it comes back to the same state space, then you're dealing with a cycle. And you don't need more than that.
Yeah, and of course, when it flips into another part of phase space or state space, as Tara was describing, mathematically that's a Lorentz attractor, which describes the indefinite cycling in phase space around one attractor, and then if it's perturbed sufficiently, it can be knocked into another one.
That's
Like,
and that's why I go back to phase transition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I
Okay.
introduced that several months ago, and it didn't get taken up on it, but I think that's what we're talking about.
I want to make an overview comment. Since first of all, we're talking about, as everybody's talking, there's a distinction between speaking as biologically versus like a biologist versus a physicist. And McLaughlin, who wrote A Different Universe, the book, he's a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and he wrote, I'm going to read the title, A Different Universe, Reinventing Physics from the Bottom Down. Describes he has a really interesting couple of paragraphs making the distinction between the way biologists think and the way physicists think. And he's saying the way they organize the world and and he says that physics comes out of and mathematics comes out of the mathematics world, and biology comes out of the medical world, the more practical medical world started. So whenever we're talking, that first of all, there's a Len has a distinctly biologist way of identifying things. Do you know what I mean? And then there's the mathematical way of identifying things. And then there's kind of a physicist way of identifying things. I think that mathematics and physics ground things very well. I think thinking in terms of state space is very important. When you describe features and functions, you're thinking more biologically, if you understand what I mean. And they're both scientifically viable. And it's important to have them all. The second thing I want to say is the distinction, whenever you start studying like Tyler did, and you look at cycles, then suddenly everything in the universe is cycles. And all the different processes are all related to cycles. If you go over and you start looking at feedback, everything in the universe is feedback, as Jay Forrester found, and everything comes out of feedback. If you look at ontogenesis or combogenesis or whatever, or emergence, or whatever you want to call it, everything comes out of that. I would really like to, so I would think with Gary's thing, it would be very important to have, like you said, the state space, the mathematics, the model of the state space, some kind of mathematical model, because it's already out there. Category theory guys are working on it. And then the features and functions as a more biological format, if you understand what I mean, for each cycle, for each process, or each pattern of interactivity, or whatever, meta pattern, whatever you want to call it. That's what I think. And then George keeps pointing to how very important it is to have a definition of systemsness in terms of and someday I'd love to do this in this meeting, is look at George's equation for systemness in his new book and take that apart. So anyway, those are my thoughts just off the top. So I think it's all valid, all the concerns are valid, but Gary's approach should have all three perspectives, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, and then to add, well, where does culture fit into this? Where do cycles such as the hunter-gatherers ritualistic cycles, foragers and farmers?
Cycles are cycles,
Fuels.
you know?
Do you know this guy?
No, what's the name, last name?
Ian Morris. He's got a couple.
I don't know that book.
Is this brand new, George? Is this brand new?
It's not brand new. I got the paperback version, but I just came across it myself. I'm about halfway through. And his thesis is really quite interesting. And it gets back to the thing I'm going to constantly come back to, which is the phase transitions. But the subtitle there is How Human Values Evolve. Talking about cultural evolution.
Oh, I love that.
And what he is saying fundamentally is there have been 3 stages of cultural evolution. Foragers had one set of values based on, and it's all based on how they capture energy, how the energy capture is accomplished, how they use it, and so forth. So we are in the Western world, and most of the world now, we're in the fossil fuel regimen, but we've gone through these transitions. And what he does is he traces the nature of values, such as the desirability of using violence to settle disputes. That in the forager value system, he didn't like somebody, he just crashed them over the head. I mean, I'm being simplistic there, but he quotes a lot of statistics from anthropological evidence and so forth. And then farmers, I won't spend a whole lot of time, but I highly recommend it.
No, it's okay, George. Again, another book to read. But I want to try and help you. So remember the unbroken sequence origins and lens diagrams. I mean, what he's essentially showing here is how cycle is important in the emergence of new systems, at higher and higher levels of complexity. This is cyclic behavior. There's an oscillation or a wave, or whatever we want to call it. But
well, and to stay with people who are currently on this Zoom call, I mean, that would exactly be what George and I and others were doing with a combogenesis ontogenesis cycle. I mean, it doesn't map exactly onto lens stuff. We would have some of those have to be treated as hypotheses, but Gary, definitely at some really high level of what do you want to call it, like ontology, at some really abstract level of ontology, yet based on real science, there's this wave of combining and integrating, forming a new kind of system, and then that has relations. So yeah, definitely, I think that could be the key. I mean, not the key, but that's clearly a really fundamental cycle, since many other cycles are going to be inside of those.
And Tom and I had this discussion about, should we include spirals in as an archetype of the general system concept of cycles, I was of the frame of mind that spirals should be included, because what we see in the emergence of greater and greater levels of complexity is essentially a cyclic behavior going up in this formation of the levels of system complexity, where the level above is built upon something which is at an underlying level, so there's a spiral of increasing complexity as these new system levels emerge. You see what I'm saying?
Well,
Model helix where there's change as well as return. So there's the wholeness, the wholes become parts and something whole.
Yes.
That's what's the same, but yet it's changing at the same time.
Yes.
So is it a helical model?
Yeah, because spirals, they build on what has been, or they build on what has been built before, or they take away from what has been built before. You have a spiral going down, but you can also have a spiral going up, where one is building up and one is cutting down. So that to me was another archetype I felt of cycles.
if you recall, figure 2.7 in my new book shows exactly
Of course
that.
I do.
Sorry, my mind keeps coming back to Lorentz attractors here, because you've actually got isomorphs of possibility includes chaos, and I realize looking at this now, I don't actually fully understand the logic of lens structure, but you've got you flip into a new attractor basin, you diversify within that attractor basin, and then at some point you've got the potential, the flip into a new level. So in terms of chaos theory mathematics, that's the mathematical model that that produces the same effects. Now, whether it's causal or whether it's just observational relationship, I'm not sure, but certainly in my mind, that's what I find it easy to relate to. That's the metaphor I find we keep coming back to. But maybe that's just because I was particularly susceptible when I read James Geek's book.
Yeah, what Len is talking about in his unbroken sequence of origins is the cyclic behavior of integration and diversification in the formation of new systems. So as a new level is as a new kind of system emerges through integration, that kind of system then goes through a diversification, which leads to the possibility of new integrations.
Sorry, I'm assuming that we all know what Lorentz attractors are. Is that valid?
For me, yeah.
So sorry, Gary, are you nodding or shaking your head?
I'm I'm not. I'm doing both. I don't know what it is, and I agree with the people who don't.
Okay, right. Sorry. Okay, so um,
Well, you
let's
can
see.
you can look in Wikipedia and it'll show you examples of various
Yeah.
what are called strange attractors.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's whole groups. I got one myself, so
Okay. So
I-
I'm going to. If you can bear with me a moment, I want to again refer back to the systems engineering body of knowledge, and why cycles are so important for systems engineers. So this is the structure of the SE book. So there's an introduction. There's a section on the systems engineering foundations, which is where I want to integrate our system science knowledge. There's systems engineering and management. And here you can see they start to talk about standard life cycle processes and practices. And then in the applications of SE, they talk about the different contexts in which the standard life cycle processes and practices are applied. And then in the related disciplines, they're talking about, how the other disciplines are involved in the life cycle and how we work with them. So life cycle is a really important concept for systems engineers, because we live our life creating and sometimes dismantling systems, transforming systems. That's essentially our role, and life cycle is really, really important for us. Now, where yeah, so within the foundations of systems engineering, we have where is it? System science. Here we go. System science. Now, if we look at system science at the moment, this is all we have. There's a little bit that talks about the context of system science and how it relates to systems thinking and systems approaches. And there's a bit on the history of system science, and there's a little bit on systems approaches, but there's very little that actually describes what system science is. Yeah. So what I want to do is under system science, I want to add in as a starting point an article on cycles as a generic system concept, and then add in other concepts underneath, and relate that then to the models that are important in cycles, how cycles are important in terms of our actual practice, in terms of principles and things like this. So that's where I'm going with this article. So
Right. So I would be glad to contribute to this, Gary, if you write it, or I guess it's partly written. I mean, is this? It's not in the form. Is this in the form of the article that you would see it being, since it's a web article?
yes, yeah. So where things are bolded like this, there would be a link to either another page or to the definition of in the glossary, for instance, or the link can go out to things like YouTube or Wikipedia. Yeah. So I've written this in Word as a starting point, but what I would do is I'd give this to the editorial team, and then they would then put it into the wiki, into the SE book itself.
So I'm wondering whether we would spend time reviewing this sentence by sentence. I mean, I remember you sent it out, and I just didn't have. I read through it, but in terms of detailed quotes, if we're going to do this as a group, we'd have to go through it, I think, sentence by sentence, right?
Yes.
We need to review it and see.
The article is only 2 pages long. Yeah. So it really is just it's an entry point for people into the knowledge, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm honored that you quote me in that first part, but I don't know whether it's. I think we have to review this, Gary. I mean, I really commend you for starting this and trying to say we're going to put something on cycles in 2 pages. But I think so. We have to review this
yes.
step by step.
Yeah.
but I think it could be done. I think it should be done as a group in a way, because we'd have to agree. It's short. So you know, if we start working on it individually, like I, for example, would, you know, will say, well, is there, I mean, is there a reference for the first sentence I'm okay with, but the second sentence I'm not okay with. I'm not okay with.
Yeah.
It's an observed feature that is considered universal. That's too, it's too strong
Yeah.
for me. And thus general in the nature of all systems. That's much too strong for me without a reference that is indisputable for that sentence. So just as an example, again, I commend you for wanting to do this and deciding to do this, and I would love to be part of it, but we have to go through it sentence by sentence in some kind of way. And is like your first part an introduction? Wait, are there named sections of this? I forgot. Oh, that's the introduction. So this first part, yeah, and I don't think I should be quoted. I'm not sure. Is the first part an abstract, or what is it before the introduction? Is that an abstract?
It's an abstract, yes.
Well, yeah. Because it does, you know,
Let me show you the structure. Yeah.
Can I ask an agenda question? I mean, my name is not on that. I'm quite happy for it not to be on that.
I meant it to be on there, actually.
Yeah, Hillary should be on.
Since it's not, can I be allowed? Oh, shit. Yeah,
yes,
I mean,
you were the intent was I was going to put us all on there. So
right.
Sorry, Hillary. Yeah.
Right. Well,
it's just one of those things that happens.
Yeah. I don't feel I can add anything beyond what I've already said to the conversation at the moment. George has picked up on the chaos theory thing and knows all about it. So does Lynn. We're actually at a friend's house at the moment. So if you want to have a long discussion about this, I think I'm adequately represented. Is it okay if I bail out?
Yeah, sure.
Right. Okay. Right. Great talking to you guys. Have lots of fun.
Okay.
And
thanks, Hillary.
see you next month.
Yep. Take care.
Bye.
Yeah. Cheers.
Yeah, so
Gary, taking a look at the document as a whole, and I'm assuming that, as you said, you want to do this with more of the patterns, meta patterns, systems, processes, whatever you're going to call them, general systems concepts. By the way, I would, just off the top, I'd separate within general systems concepts. I'd call them meta patterns or systems. You don't like systems processes. I don't care what you call them, but separate the patterns out from the concepts. Then when you do describe concepts, you will be using those patterns in the description, but that would make it in descriptions of concepts, but that would help delineate, help make it work. The other thing that I find is very helpful is to organize maybe each one in terms, Len figured this out a long time ago, in terms of definitions. And there could be a number of definitions, examples, maybe not in this order, the features and the functions of each system's pattern that you're going to show. Then it's easier to discuss and describe what each pattern is.
Yeah.
So that you would have, you know, a meta pattern for each pattern, you know, for how you're going to organize this.
So
this section.
That's what I mean when I use the term general system concept. So that this concept of cycle is instantiated with a number of different archetypes, which all are representations of cycle, and inherent the essential features of cycles. Yeah. So this is why I refer to it as a general system concept, because all of these different archetypes exhibit, we believe, the features that are associated with cycles. Yeah, and this comes back to, you know, your key question last time, Tyler. What is the difference between? I think you said, what is the difference between cycle and solitons? You know, when is cycles different to solitons? And the answer is that they're not. These are all instantiations of this general system concept.
It's more general, yeah, I would say.
Yeah.
Soliton's a specialization of wave, which is a specialization of cycle.
Yeah. Now, in knowledge management, and again, I'm not an expert in knowledge management, but in knowledge management and the way that we are modeling our architectural knowledge, is there are essentially three different layers. The top layer is the conceptual layer, and then you have the logical layer, and the logical layer inherits the conceptual features, but in a way which is specific to particular domains. So you go from the generic to the specific in terms of concepts. So these are specific concepts, and this is a general concept. And then what you have in the physical layer is the actual instantiations in for want of a better word, real life. Yeah. So, when you go from the logical concept, which is spin, you can then give tangible examples of what spin is in the real world. Like a spinning top or a spinning mind. Yeah. And that's the way that this is structured.
Yeah, so I agree with this. This is an interesting way to structure it. We have to be clear where it's not meant to be complete. It's not meant to do all the subtypes of the cycles, or I don't think we're claiming we have a methodology. We are. This is. I don't think. This is in a way subjective from us as pattern people, systems people, parsing the phenomena of cycle, but we're not saying these are the 6 subgroups of all cycles, I think,
No,
right? We're not saying that.
These are the 6 that we've identified, through the work so far. Yeah.
It's definitely incomplete. In fact, the PowerPoint that I sent out has a more complete one, but even that one is incomplete. It's something that can go on indefinitely, adding detail or adding elements to, but it's a way to start to organize it and bring some order out of what I think Len has, where a lot of things are not thoroughly defined, or at least I can't see them as being thoroughly defined. And relationships between them are not necessarily shown.
I mean, I think it's interesting, the chemical reaction cycle. I think that's what's meant by reaction cycle, chemical reacting to hypercycle to the cell cycles, like a growth cycle, life cycle. That the life cycle is such a generic term. It's good for that. But it is, oh man. I mean, I'm generally okay with this, without any suggestions of how culture could be brought in, like mental cycles or something. Like memory is important. It's in George's equation, and like the one thing that strikes me here, there's nothing cultural at this point at all. But humans make calendars. Humans have rituals. Language as conversation is cyclic was probably really key in the origin of humans. Some kind of linguistic cycle between people.
Because I think when you're talking about those things, Tyler, you're into what is called the physical level. The actual instantiations in our universe. We need to unpick these things, and to identify the things that really should be here in the logical level, and the things which are more examples of actual spin or actual waves or actual life cycles.
Well, if I were to do this logically, from my viewpoint, the 3 subdivisions under cycles would be it cycles in the realm of physical law, cycles in the realm of biological evolution, and cycles in the realm of physical evolution. I mean cultural evolution. I would still stand behind these three great groupings of phenomena of the physical, chemical, the biological, and the cultural. I keep on coming back to that, which is why the combogenesis can inform this kind of thing, because I see much more clearly than I saw when I wrote meta patterns. And then those three would have subdivisions under them. So
That's
like
another,
a
that's
predator.
another, yeah, it's another way of slicing the cake. Yeah.
Yeah, because to me right now, wave spin and
Yeah. But it,
oscillation, we're taking from Len's stuff, and he even said he doesn't even agree that these are necessarily cyclic. He said this is still a hypothesis whether the cycle, and whether the cycle in his mind, whatever it is, something that has stages, is a is an isomorph, and these other are different isomorphs. I think he said that in one of his emails, that he considers it still a hypothesis.
Yeah. The thing is, Tyler, is that if we were to subdivide it in terms of those different domains, we would immediately lose the possibility to look for the patterns across them. Yeah.
Right.
Because
But do you think
you see waves in all three of those domains? Yeah.
Yep.
And by studying waves across those three different domains, we get a better understanding of waves.
How is a wave? So if we go in, I mean, I don't know if people are in. How is a wave different from oscillation? I can't. I have to see the definition here, Tom. I'm sorry, it's really hard on my screen. Maybe somebody can just describe it.
These were taken from Google and dictionaries, yeah, Tom?
Yes.
Yeah. So wave is a periodic disturbance of the particles of a substance that may be propagated without net movement of the particles, such as in the passage of undulating motion, heat, or sound.
And so how is a wave, how is there a wave in chemistry? How is there a wave in biology? And how is there a wave in culture? I'd be curious what the examples are. Anybody?
In the PowerPoint, I have some examples, but there's a lot more that
just off the top of your head.
Would you like to take the screen, Tom?
Let's see if I can bring mine up.
And the oscillation is how is the oscillation different from a?
So an oscillation is the repetitive variation, typically in time, of some measure about a central value, often a point of equilibrium, or between two or more different states. The term vibration is precisely used to describe mechanical oscillation. Familiar examples of oscillation include a swinging pendulum or an alternating current.
Right. So is this also going to be Tom or anybody or Gary in biology and culture? Oscillation?
Yes, if we see that as a cycle and it fits the definitions. But as I was saying, the more specialization you get, the more general cycle becomes. And then the question comes up, is it worth anything if it covers so many different things? Is it a useful generalization? So maybe something needs to change.
Yeah, I think that is the question, and I'm just trying to take all this in and think about it. One big question I've got is, even in producing this document, why are we worried about cycles and sub patterns of cycles and so on? What purpose does it serve in system science?
Yeah, that's a big question I have, and I guess why I've spent so much time on it. I've been talking to Len about this for probably 5 years or more, and he's always wanted me to model some of his isomorphs, and I never quite saw the benefit of it with relation to systems. So when we started talking about cycles, I thought, well, this is a chance to look into one more deeply and see if it really is worthwhile to support the other direction that we were trying to go. And that question is still very much open open to me. But I had trouble dealing with what he had on cycles because things were not well defined and relationships were not shown between them. So I see this as just the beginning of a process, if it's worthwhile doing, that we keep, as Tyler has done, give some very good suggestions on things that should be added or changed. But the fact that you have these definitions and relationships together, you can check validate the cohesion. Does it all fit together? And my experience in modeling before is you find things don't fit together. People look at them individually, and when you try to integrate them, they don't fit together because there's different assumptions, different definitions, misunderstandings, factual problems, all sorts of things. So you have to go through a process of modeling to get that all out and get a coherent picture of it. So that's what I'm proposing to do, but that takes time and effort. And the question is this the right thing to be spending our time and effort on?
Well, Gary, can we go back to, I can't even remember how we got off on this, other than Lynn made a presentation. Is there a reason why you wanted to start with this sort of generic concept of cycles as getting your first pages up on the CBOC?
Yeah, so let me stop sharing a second so I can see my full screen.
I think in the CBOC, this would be my set of objectives. What a phenomena is, why it is considered systemic, part of a system, any system, and then how to go about using it. Like, this is for engineers, so what will the engineers want to do with that knowledge?
Okay, so let me go back again.
I'll tell you, Gary, the hardest part about this one, and I'll tell you, as I'm writing my thing, I have passed by on cycles because it's really easy to write about feedback. It's really easy to write about a whole bunch of different networks, you know, really easy to write about certain things. Cycles, I'm just going to use, you know, it's going to be one of those patterns that I'm just going to basically define and then give some examples. And you could consider, you know, there's debate about spin or whatever, you know, in a very general way.
Yeah. But as I mentioned, cycles are so fundamental to systems engineering. Yeah. And I'll explain how we get there. Yeah. So after this part, which is all about terms and understanding of the landscape of cycles in terms of its many forms, yeah, we then go into hopefully a diagram which hopefully Tom is making some progress on, which is about, you know, what are the essential features of cycles, and then we go into, well, there are actually some really useful models that help us to understand and deal with the universe in terms of cycles. So we've got Kinefin, Panicky, Observe, Orient, Decide and Act, the spiral model, the problem solution system model. So these are all models which are all built on the phenomena of cycles. It's also evident in Peter Sengley's first law of the fifth discipline. Today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. The problem you inherit today is likely the result of a series of solutions that seemed right at the time, made by people that are probably no longer around. Yeah. Cycle is evident in the work of Robert Rosen and John Kinnaman's relational theory, which is working towards a mathematical underpinning of the whole-on as a framework for systems research. The essence of that is in the center of this diagram. The one spin of the whole-on represents the four phases of engineering: conceptualization, architecting, design, and integration. And then when you integrate a new system, you get a new situation and you have to reconceptualize. So our engineering life cycle is resident in this model and underpinned by the concept of cycles. So this is why cycles are so important. Yeah. Now, if we can do this for the other general system concepts, then I believe that we will create something incredibly powerful and useful. And this is all about establishing our shared orientation for system science, which we don't have at the moment. So we've really got to get to grips with these generic system concepts and how they relate to actual practice. So that's why I'm trying to do this. And I need your help.
You need a lot more than our help.
Mm.
The more we get into it, the more I begin to, I don't know. I just think it is so complex, so complicated, and
Well,
and beyond a simple statement that, like you mentioned, all these management cycle things, you know, observe, orient,
yeah, decide and act, plan, do, check, act.
and what they are, those are cyclical, but they're producing a spiral condition. Senge is saying that,
Yeah,
you know, every time you go through this, you're going to end up with a solution that's going to be cause a problem down the road.
yeah,
That's a spiral kind of
it is.
structure.
The problem we've got is, you know, you asked about the value of this. And this really comes back to the essential question: what is the value of a systems approach? Yeah. So either we believe that a systems approach and system science is going to be useful and we pursue it, or we give up. Yeah.
No, I believe that too. That's why I've been working on this book.
Yeah.
So I see this paper as, I mean, it's a web paper. We're not trying to get something into Nature at this point where we have to be on top of every single sentence, but you are showing the importance of cycles in different phenomenological regimes, not trying to say it's going to be complete. So I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being part of this almost as is, because but the abstract has to be completely redone. The abstract has to make the statement, why is this paper here? What are we not claiming versus what are we claiming? I think that has to be in there in some kind of way. I mean, the idea of the logical level, you know, we could spend the rest of our lives on that probably. the major genera of cycles, let's say, and that's something I actually am interested in. And as I reread my chapter in my book, I mean, I had divided things differently. I divided things into physical cycles, physical spins in physical space, and spins in property space. So going around, and then I had things about binary cycles that are and some of that are mental. Some of the human tendency to make binary cycles: the weekend and the work week, the weekend and the work week. But as I reread my own chapter, I said, wow, I really didn't make a case for these divisions to be the divisions. And maybe there are not the divisions. But just to propose that diagram that you and Tom worked out as an example of something that can be done with cycles, I love. I'm fine with that. It's really good. So I'm actually fine with the thing if you want to try to get something up, but the abstract has to be an abstract.
Yeah.
What is being done, because that current abstract, the sentence about universal in all systems, we have to take that out. It's too strong a statement without a clear definition of what a cycle is. It should be a little bit softer, but bold at the same time. Bold, but more humble.
Yeah, but I do believe that cycle is a universal feature of all systems.
Well, you believe that, but we don't. What evidence are we?
Well, the universe itself has a life cycle, and we're all within the universe. The universe at some point is going to come to an end, so we will come to an end. Yeah. So there you
We've
go.
got
There's
theories.
the proof.
We've got theories about it, but we don't know them.
Yeah. Every
Gary, but
system
back
has a
to what-
life cycle.
Well, what's the cycle? What's the cycle inside the proton that's made up with quarks? The quarks are interacting, and they get some. You get cycles of. Yes, I can argue that there's cycles of the formation of quark antiquark pairs that are formed and then annihilate each other.
Yeah.
But that's not because the cycle. This is like the Platonic thing. Are these all imprints of something cosmic? Sometimes I think yes. When I was writing meta patterns, I was thinking yes, I was in that zone. And now as I read my own chapter, it's not that I'm not in that zone, but the zone is pretty scary to be in some ways, is to start like having your head that all cycles are manifestation of capital cycle, like a god or something. I mean, I gotta say, it's an interesting space to be in, but I don't know if I can justify being in that all the time.
I have a book that was just written in 2016, put together in 2016. It's about 26 different papers, essays on information from the point of view of biologists, different kinds of biologists, physicists, biologists, and theologists, and information as a pattern. You know, you could say the same thing. So these things are, if it fits within what Gary is describing as he's describing them as concepts. I think concepts I have to disagree with that one. It's a philosophical term. It's thoughts that we have, concepts or ideas that we're having. We're identifying actual patterns in the universe. There is no doubt that there are cycles everywhere. Now, are there cycles? I always have, whenever you get to quantum mechanics, sorry, not enough is known. I don't go there. I get way too, I mean, the rules aren't established at quantum level. Do you know what I mean? The examples aren't clear. But pretty much at the physical and the biological level, cycles can easily be described, basic cycles. Then you get off into, and physics too. But then you get off into things like spin, you get off into things like the other, what you called, Gary, then you get off into, is this a cycle or is not? Well, it has aspects of similarity to cycles, but so what are the features, what are the functions that are similar, and what are the distinctions that are different? What are the models? How do you model it differently? Like I mean, how are they modeled out? When you're looking at what are the models out there that describe spin? How are they similar to models of state space of cycles? Those distinctions have to be clarified. And those are clarified not of concepts. Those are not concepts. Well, sure, everything's conceptual, but they're actual, it's just as conceptual as the bird sitting out my window. We're actually, do you know? Anyway, lots of.
Yeah, no, what we're talking about is a knowledge concept.
Well, so Lynn, the problem with the use of the word concept, I don't have quite that problem, Lynn, with the word, but it depends on what the word is being used to do. I mean, you were saying a pattern or meta pattern. I once wanted to call these things, and an editor said, no, I'm not going to let you do that in the book. I figured which book. I wanted to call them cosmic concepts.
Yeah.
You know, these isomorphs, these isomorphies, I wanted to call cosmic concepts.
In modeling, the term semantics is often used. What is the meaning of this term?
Yeah.
Are you happier with that than concept?
Maybe what if we did multiple terms, Lynn, like concepts, comma, patterns, comma, what was your other term? What was your preferred term there, Lynn?
Well, look, George calls them meta patterns. Len calls them systems processes. You know, I mean, I don't care what you guys call them, but concepts is a little broad. They're actual patterns.
Yeah,
Repeat.
Patterns of interactivity, systems interactivity. I don't care what you call them, but just
Well,
make that distinction.
all right. So
What
in
I'm
my
trying to say.
mind, literally, a concept is a pattern of neural firings that is consistent, has some reverberation, but it's a model of what our perceptual system is
Sure.
giving us, and it changes over time as we learn more. So
But this is a
I don't see
particular
it. I
kind
don't
of
see it.
concept. This is a particular kind of concept. It's not just a.
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand the. It's a level of abstraction that goes beyond. I mean, so Gary's got this physical, logical, and general, right? And so these are levels of abstraction. The concrete system is concrete system. The logical is how we organize that into groupings that make sense, right? And then finally, the general is, well, all of these share these common aspects. So in one sense, all of these are concepts. And
Well, everything is a concept, George. That's the thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Exactly. So are we going to make a distinction for what these concepts are, these general concepts? Are we going to make that distinction, or are we just going to call them concepts? You know?
Yeah, Lynn, I think what Lynn's raising is important, because I wouldn't call the life cycle of an organism a concept. I would call it a concept when our humans bring it into their mental worlds.
That's anthropomorphic, exactly.
But I wouldn't call the existence. I mean, that's why the editor didn't like me calling them cosmic concepts, because the organisms are not evolving a concept. I mean, I would prefer to keep it like that. Have any of you? I recently read this book called Why Information Grows. Did any of you, Why Information Grows, The Evolution of Order from Atoms to Economies by Cesar Hidalgo? Have any of you heard of this person? He's MIT. But I like the book in some ways, but really quickly, he uses the word information to mean the formation of an atom. So he's basically saying pattern or structure, and he's using the word information in this book. And it was driving me crazy in a certain sense, because it's just not my preferred way to think about information. But I was just wondering where anybody, but it's similar to this, it's a similar issue to trying to say everything's a concept. Like, so I would tend not to go there. I want the concepts only to be in human modeling, in the human mind. Is that what you're saying, Lynn?
I'm saying I'm taking a biologist's point of view, let's put it this way, and saying we're actually identifying patterns of things out there.
Yeah.
There are actually cycles out there.
Yeah.
The sun does go around. Yeah, I mean, the earth does go around the sun. The moon does go around the earth. This is not just we're taking it from the conceptual to actually, this is a process that we can see throughout time, throughout the universe in different areas. And we can give examples of it in the physical realm, the biological realm, and the social realm. No doubt about it. Mm-hmm. It's throughout.
Yeah.
It's an isomorph throughout time, history, and the physical things. It's not just a concept. It's actually, every single culture describes them. It's like, it's underlying systems engineering work. To actually define what a cycle is, Gary is absolutely right. It's completely important. This is not just conceptual. This is actually defining a pattern that we identify. It's not, there's a difference between we're actually identifying I don't like to say thing, but an activity, a pattern of activity.
This is
Yeah,
So
phenomenological.
everything Lynn,
I don't
sorry,
like to get,
George,
you know, it's very, when you start talking in terms of philosophy, you get into the conceptual phenomenological world. Let's get even simpler and say we're actually describing a thing and put our money where our mouth is. Do you know what I mean? That's the way I think. And I could be.
I agree. I'm
That's
going to
what
let
I'm doing.
George go. I agree. Basically, I agree. I think what Lynn just said, Gary, if you can retrieve those last 5 minutes, a
It's
lot of that
recorded.
could be the abstract, and then the conclusion. It could be repeated in the conclusion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that ties into like the human design cycles. That here's humans inventing cycles for usefulness to make progress. Let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Ultimately, Gary, what you've been saying is ultimately, and what Lynn has said and what George has said, is that ultimately the purpose of this is if we can understand how nature has evolved successful systems throughout time, then we are going to get better at evolving our own systems. So what do systems consist of? So that we can design our own systems, and that's what are these things in systems, you know, or what are these processes in systems? Just
yeah.
own it, you know.
Yeah.
It's an ownership and a naming.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm referring to in terms of a concept is related to a knowledge structure. Yeah, so a knowledge structure is an interrelated collection of facts or knowledge about a particular topic.
I know, but I don't want to support a conceptual knowledge structure. I don't want to go into that. I want to describe like what is a bear? What is a tree?
It's not.
You know.
So this is not a conceptual knowledge structure. This will be the knowledge structure for system science. You know, and there will be conceptual things, logical things, and actual physical things within that knowledge structure. Yeah, the concept is yeah.
That's fine. But I'm saying that's fine, but this is where I disagree. We're not describing just, I understand what you're saying there as far as knowledge structures. We're building a knowledge structure, but the knowledge structure is actually a description of things that occur in nature.
Yes.
It's not,
but
you know.
Okay, once again, listening to this, Lynn,
Yeah.
back up a little bit, will you?
Okay, I'm just, yeah.
I mean, at some point in time, you get into metaphysics.
Yes.
When we're in the systems world, you're dealing with meta science, so you're going to get into metaphysical arenas. And again, it's a matter of abstraction, level of abstraction.
Yeah. And every single word that we use is a concept. Every single word that we use is a concept, and it comes with a semantic meaning. Yeah. And all of the words that we use are part of our knowledge structure in our brains. Yeah.
But if you generalize the concept,
when we communicate, we have to have a common language that we use when we talk about systems, and there are different levels of abstraction in that. There's the real world things. There are things that are very conceptual, and there's stuff in the middle that helps us to form that middle ground.
I get it. I'm just saying that the basic concept that we're looking at here isn't just a concept. I want to describe the concept.
Okay, look.
Instead of say a concept, you know, hey.
To keep my name on that, I'm going to insist that we do exactly this. A cycle is described by identifying the state space. Once you can characterize the state space and measure the actual states as they're entered into, number one, and then you can describe the trajectory of that cycle via the phase space. Those two things are the most practical things that any engineer would need to know.
Thank you.
Need to understand. And then anything else is getting into the realm of nonlinear systems that Hillary was bringing up before, chaotic systems,
Yeah,
strange attractor dynamics, and so on. That's not cyclical.
yeah. So when you talk about the state space, what are you talking about?
Well, every system can be described in a let's say Euclidean geometry by virtue of it having a particular state. So let's say we're looking at the planet from deep space, from the moon or something like that, and we can identify in a grid fashion the continents and the oceans and all this kind of stuff. Well, as that thing turns, we can actually take snapshots. So we say that the state of the system is changing in time, right? And then,
and George, can you apply that to Gary's diagram? I mean, one of many that could be used, but the one Gary has in there of the design cycle.
yeah, each one of those things is a stage. Remember,
Is a
Lynn had something that it goes through stages, right? And then we had a discussion about, well, does everything go through stages? You've identified those as very general, but those are states that this system is in.
Yes, yeah. So
And then it transitions from that state to the next state, and so on.
What you're talking about is the.
So let me finish, please. So when we go through the entire thing and get back to the same state we were in before, we have demonstrated a cyclical dynamic, right? As opposed to a chaotic dynamic. Chaotic dynamic can sometimes appear to be cyclicals, like our weather patterns and climate and so forth. But in fact, they are non-ergodic. And so they're not technically a cycle.
How do you describe something which is cyclical and an arrow that's helical, like using these design cycles to get somewhere iteratively? Sorry,
yeah.
I'm blowing that word.
I'll show you, Gary.
So
Gary,
could
can
you
I take over the screen?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to get at.
So there's a cyclical nature, but then there's I think that's a lot of the reasons humans are inventing these cycles is to not just go round and around, but to use the cycle to get somewhere. Which I think which is what that design cycle diagram is doing, Gary, right? It's to get somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what this is the simple version of the ontogenic cycle, right? So we have this phase in which there's auto-organization going on. That's Len's integration phase. We get new assemblies generated and having new potentialities. That's his differentiation. I forget what he calls it.
Yeah.
But that gives rise to new behaviors, and that leads to new potentials for auto-organization.
Yeah.
Now that's a cycle because we go through those stages. But at each time we do, we're actually operating in a new medium. So we go from atoms to molecules to cells and so forth.
Yep.
And here's the spiral structure that comes out of that, namely complexity. We're looking at the breadth of this as being the increase in complexity over time. And so we go from simple systems to more complex systems. Every time we go through this cycle, we're producing a new stage here, right?
Yeah, that's good, George. That's good. So you've got the horizontal being. Oh wait, you got the increasing complexity on two directions. I thought it was going to be one direction where the first molecules are simple, but they give rise to more complex molecules on the other side. And then the first cells are simple, but they give rise to more complex cells. First multi-cell. So, do you mean you're increasing complexity to be a two-arrowed thing?
The spiral's not only going up, but it's getting broader.
What?
Oh, it's getting
spiral's not
broader.
only
Thanks,
going
Tom.
up, it's getting
Thanks.
broad.
It's getting broader. It's getting
Yeah.
broader.
That was the intent.
Mm, mm.
The fact that you raised that question, I may have to look at it a little bit differently, but yeah, basically it's the
I see
breadth.
what. Thanks,
Yeah.
Tom. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I see what you're
So
saying.
you're talking about the
Um,
diverse. You're representing the spread in diversity within those levels.
But is the complexity, George, because now the civilization contains, there's a couple different ways of talking about complexity here. One is the nestedness, where the geopolitical state contains all the preceding levels.
Right.
That's clearly, I mean, I like that kind of complexity because it's so clearly objective when you can talk about it.
Right.
Versus another kind of complexity where you're comparing some kind of like this gets us into the debates about how to define complexity, the algorithmic complexity of a geopolitical state compared to proteins, let's say.
Right.
Or like the
I did
or the
present at one point what I call Simonian, Herb Simon's view of complexity, which is basically what you were talking about, the nested.
the nest number of levels.
Yeah, or holons containing holons containing. So on. So that can actually be characterized as a measure. Pardon?
That's pretty objective. It's potentially objective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's fun is the same little screen could be used to describe hierarchy as a process, cycle as a process, ontogenesis as a process. It's all there. It'd be easier to see it as cycle, to see instead of the straight line, to see more how new behaviors lead to the full arrow around. You do it at the bottom. It's really nice, that little green and red loop thing. So it's fun because you can take the same thing and say, this is hierarchies, how hierarchies form in nature. This is example of a cycle. This is an example of ontogenesis or combogenesis or whatever. And you can, so it's an example of how auto-organization works or plays out. Emergence. It's an example of emergence. I mean, it's pretty much all right there. A lot of it's just right there.
Why I'd like to get back to the ontogenesis, combogenesis discussion at some point.
Exactly, right.
It is integral to it, isn't it?
You too.
I have a finite state machine in my PowerPoint that I distributed recently. I think these stages and states are pretty much the same. So
yeah, you could, as long as you can characterize any system in terms of the states that it can be in, which can be stages, or excitation, like when an electron gets excited and moves to a new state, higher energy state, and then comes back in. All of those kinds of things can be characterized, and they are very objective. And they may not be easy to measure directly, but we can at least model them. And that's what a finite state machine does, is models these things, as long as they are ergodic and truly cyclical. But there are many phenomena that are not truly cyclical.
Can we include these diagrams in the article, George?
Pardon me?
Can we include these diagrams in the article?
Well, I mean, it would take a lot of explanation. That's why I'm writing a frigging book, because it's really not simple stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't know how a engineer is going to look at that and say, oh yeah, that's useful.
I think cycles, engineers use it a lot and everything, but as I started from the very beginning, cycles is one of the more difficult ones to describe. It's really difficult. It's a tough place to start, Gary. It is, just from my experience. It's a tough
Yeah.
place to start. However, that said, maybe it could be shaken down.
Could
Well,
I share a screen for a minute?
yeah,
Yeah.
Okay.
it might be a way of saying, look, engineers, this is a really important concept,
Mm.
cycles, and you're going to find it lots of different places
Well, they know
in
it
lots
is.
of different forms.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you need to be aware of it because it can be the source of some serious problems. For example, if the timing loop in a feedback loop is not balanced with other things that are going on, and when cycles interact with one another, what's going on.
Mm.
Well,
But
I like what George just said. Gary, that's really good what George just said. That's a reason for paying attention to cycles on a general nature, because it may expand your mind to it just making you aware of cycles as a generic thing. And George, you said it much better than I did, but it can help. It can be useful to think generally, because it may get you out of traps or something like that.
Len
You were
has
saying.
great examples of what he calls systems pathology, and he calls, under for cycles specifically as great examples.
Mm.
It'd be a great way to start an introduction to say in a general terms cycles, because everybody kind of knows what a cycle is. I mean, in a general way.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to relate it to how it's useful.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
Len actually, I think in systems
Yeah.
pathology, he does kind of nail that one
Yeah.
pretty well.
Mm.
I think if we can
Well,
look it up.
again, if we could get those pathologies related to cycles, again, there can be a link to that page in the article. Yeah, because you know
So I'm
the problem
I'm
is
just
there's
showing.
just so much information; it's not accessible at the moment.
Uh,
Sorry, go
so
ahead,
this
Tyler.
I started working on. So I started working. I'm just going to do this for a second. So I started working on a diagram that didn't make it into the Quarks to Culture book, but I was trying to put this
Mm,
combogenesis ontogenesis cycle
mm,
into this kind of format where it's expanding
mm,
in the number of layers, and on the left hand side the things combine to be this thing on the right hand side, which then the circle becomes one of those small circles on the left hand side,
mm,
which then goes to the right hand side. But then I tried to show that it complexifies a number of
mm,
layers by doing these concentric circles.
mm,
So I decided it was too, I don't know, it could have gone in the book, but I didn't, work it out fully to my liking, George. These
yeah.
things are kind of tough to represent. But
Mm,
that was my attempt. I think George, this captures everything that you have. Not that, I mean, not everything. There's correspondences. I
mm.
don't do the energy. I didn't have the energy part, but just your main spiral going up. This is my attempt, I think, to capture something very similar.
right, um,
Yeah, see the parallels.
here's my version of that. So rather than, I think what would be confusing, Tyler, about the diagram you showed was the fact that there are three things in each
Yeah,
concrescence.
yeah.
Where I'm trying to show, these guys retain some of their when they first come together in combination, and then we get new combinations and so on. So we're moving in the complexity, the Simonian complexity of these things gets more and more, or higher and higher as we go.
So
And then,
you're showing them as organs, not nestedness. Okay.
well, no, there is. Okay, so not really organs. No, this is
No.
the initial combination that then is available to make new combinations. This is the ontogenic cycle. So these could be, I'll start with atoms, So we get atoms, we have a covalent bond exists, but we've got some valence electrons still available. And so we can get larger and larger, more complicated things developing. But What did you mean by organ? Is it maybe
Well,
I
I thought since you're repeating the red circles and you're repeating the blue ellipses, that these were something similar in each one.
well,
But then you're adding the green box, and then you're adding the purple triangle. So
Yeah.
I'm not.
this is just the way in which things become more complex at a given level, right?
Oh, at a given, you mean within a eukaryotic cell,
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay.
or within a
I-
multicellular, within an animal?
It's not in.
Are you saying that would apply to animal evolution? That applies to agrovillage evolution?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Well, it's in the other book. Yeah, it's in the other book. And I don't want to go searching for
I
it.
mean, your spiral diagram is pretty clear, and I agree with Lynn that the little color thing down at the bottom is particularly helpful to understand what the sides mean, what the spin
Yeah.
means
Okay.
in this. What the stage, because in a way at the bottom are your states, the general states of the ontogenic cycle. The
Right.
states, the
Right.
fundamental states are emergence and selection and auto-organization, something like that. That's those three,
Right.
I think.
Well,
Yeah.
they're characterized
like
in that way, so we can call
Yeah,
them
they're
states.
characterized in that way. Yeah.
Why isn't this?
But I think Gary, you got some good idea. I hope you got some good ideas. Uh, I personally am really supportive of this. If the abstract is can emphasize
Maybe you can
the,
help me with that, Tyler.
oh man, but it's not my paper. I'll help you with it when you rewrite the abstract. I can't write the abstract because it's not my paper. I would have done a very, very different paper. And
Okay.
so I can't, you got to take a stab at the abstract that is more of an abstract, not an evocative. It has to be something about the usefulness of this to engineers.
Okay. Well, I had you on record earlier, so I'll try and find it.
George said some good things and Lynn said some really good things.
Has Tom dropped off?
Maybe he
has,
didn't say,
yeah.
It looks like it.
Yeah.
he didn't, did he leave a chat?
No,
I don't see
maybe
anything.
he's lost his connection.
I just put a link to the Wikipedia article on state spaces, Gary.
Okay, thanks.
This is here's one thing that I'm a little nervous about. We could end up embarrassing ourselves horribly because we're trying to characterize something that has been characterized in physics, mathematics, biology, astronomy. Yeah, I mean, people have done all of this before. They know exactly what they're talking about. And if we come up and say, oh, well, this is a systems concept that came out of system science, then everybody's going to laugh. They're going to say, no, you guys, I don't know what planet you live on, but we've known about these phenomena ever since Galileo.
Well, that's why it's important, I think, George, right from the top to say generally systems can be found in all these different areas. Link to those different areas where they're described. They're right in Wikipedia. I mean, cycles in mathematics, cycles in biology, it's all there. You can just link, and just say, see, because of that, we recognize it as a general systems process. Now, what are some of those, or pattern or concept or whatever the hell we want to call it? And then we say, okay, here are and I agree with you about state space. Okay, here are the identifying features within, the state space shows this, this, and this, whether you're talking, for a general model that would describe all of those things. It's pretty much well known, like self-organization, feedback. They're easily applied in all of the different sciences and generally applied network. generally applied in all the different sciences now in understanding. Cycles is no different. But cycles hasn't been described in the same way. There aren't whole books written well, there are, but generally people generally describing cycles the way they're generally describing networks and generally describing applying self-organization and feedback. You know, that's where it's at. That's the difficulty of it, is you just, so I don't know, I haven't looked up cycles in Wikipedia, which way they go. They might.
Lynn, would you say, does the network have inherently a cyclic nature to it for a bunch of things to be linked in a web? Is it going to, is there,
and Barbasi in Network Sciences textbook actually has a working definition for cycle, and it's a mathematical graph theory thing. It's a path that ends up in the same place.
Right,
That's
and that's a perfect kind of state space.
Exactly, that's a state space thing. A state space, as far from what I can, in my simplistic way of putting it, because I'm trying to simplify things, but I don't know if it's. I avoid writing things too simply, but has to have at least 3 measurements to describe the thing that you're looking at, and then so you have an XYZ axes, 3 axes, and then that point moves through time. I mean, somebody as simple as a nurse, going to take every 4 hours doing vital signs, recording vital signs, that moves on the graphs. That's the state space of an individual's health, overall look at any given time. And that's where describing cycles in terms of state space makes perfect sense. But let me see if it's in Wikipedia. Let me see what we got.
This is a good statement, Gary. Maybe something like that should be in the abstract too.
Okay, cycle, right away, right at the top, Google it. It says cycle. See definitions in all physics, biology, technology, literature. So right away, there are definitions in all those different places. But there's a general noun, a series of events that are regularly repeated in the same order. That's the Google definition.
That's what's in the article already, I think.
Yeah, you do have it in the article.
Yeah.
And maybe it'd be a good idea somewhere in there, not in the abstract, but somewhere in there, make sure that this is differentiated from chaotic dynamics. Not everything is a cycle. You find them a lot of places, but you also find chaotic dynamics.
George, when you have a chaotic dynamical system that is a strange attractor, and these things make these loops in phase space, and they don't return to exactly the same point with all parameters to the nth decimal point, but they do return off into the same sort of general area.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
Well, one of the things that happens is you can actually make predictions. Not very precise predictions, but you know that if you have an actual attractor basin, then you can say that if I can pinpoint the phenomena in phase space here, I know that it's going to be generally in this area over here. This is why we can predict weather.
Yeah.
Is that we get enough measurements along the phase space, we can predict within some margin of error that it's going to be in this state at some future time.
There is no such thing as something coming back to the same.
Exactly the same, right?
Cycles are stochastic. They are not. I mean, that's what George is saying right now. It's kind of like I was just reading this wonderful book. I'm going to give you, here it is, A Different Universe.
Lynn, I tried it. But I couldn't. Well, first of all, the physics, I can't understand it to really judge it. But I did try it. I was aware of McLaughlin's work. Yep.
Yeah, well, it's a fun book for me to read.
Okay.
More than, I would say it's more fun than
Okay.
technically it's, yeah. But what was I going to say about it? But he does talk about the particulars and the general, and how the collective, I should say, the collective and the individual things, and how the constants that physics sees are constants that happen because of collective activity, which is very interesting. So when you look at cycles, to say it's happening because of activities that result, where you can say, hey, it's going to come back to kind of the same thing again, but it's never going to be the same again. We could, just like ontogenesis or combogenesis is cyclical, but it's definitely not coming back to the same thing. So it's tricky to describe, but it's a state space thing, like George said.
It's a state space thing, yeah.
So let's be very clear, though. A cycle technically is something that comes back to the same state, right?
Yeah.
It may be stochastic, but in fact, you can model those with what are called non-deterministic state, finite state machines. And you can show that, but eventually it does come back to the same state. That's an ergodic system.
And George, does that mean there's no perfect cycle? There's no real cycle?
Right.
No, huh?
Well,
let's take a reciprocating internal combustion engine as an example.
Yeah.
Right. This guy is going to do the same thing over and over again for as long as that engine lasts. Right. And that's a cycle. It can be characterized by a complete by a state space that you can then measure positions of the piston and so forth. But eventually, because of friction and
something
other
will break down.
things, something's going to break down. So in that sense, there's no such thing as an everlasting cycle.
But it's still a zone of a parameter change. Like if you could get down to an atomic level, that piston probably never reaches the exact, something that is precise. It's never going to be exactly the same, but it's within a parameter.
We wouldn't know that. We can't measure to that level of precision to be able to say that.
And I guess but that relates to what I was saying about the chaotic dynamics. They can get into zones, like the weather is never like these weather cycles that happen. The reason that they can make predictions better, because now they have so much data, and of course they run the models, but they have so much data, they say, okay, when these conditions were like this before, it rained 2 days from now in these spots, but it's not going to predict precisely the amounts of rain. So in the weather is a chaotic dynamical system, and yet it's cyclic because it gets into states. These state spaces are kind of fuzzily determined, right? I mean, there's zones of parameters.
You'd have to stretch the definition of states.
So the weather people call it rain. The weather people call it rain, right? You get a little weather report. Yeah.
I just had a thought. Okay, what we're describing here is we're describing the process of a cycle. And the outcome of the cycle, because of the process, will change, but the process of the cycle will remain the same. The thing will go through the process, but the outcome will be different. each time because of the processes of the cycle.
Mm.
So instead of, so when you're looking like in the engineering cycle, Gary, you're doing the same processes again and again, but you're coming out at the end with a different outcome, and then you
Yes.
start the same processes again and again.
Yes, yes.
So it's not really the outcome that has changed, but the processes are the same. The actual cycle,
Yeah.
the recursion, the different
Mm.
parts of the cycle,
Yeah.
all that can be
Yeah.
identified.
Yeah, and the
Okay, and that gives me an idea of a,
circumstances have changed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
it gives
that's
me an
my
idea of a
second thing.
distinction between George's piston, that of course the piston is doing this to make the car move.
Mm.
So and these design cycles, but the cycle that is meant to be exactly repetitive as much as is possible, as much as engineering can control it,
Mm.
versus a cycle like that design cycle that is meant to get somewhere, right? That's
Well,
designed,
that's what I just showed. That ontogenic cycle is
and the
the
ontogenic
cycle,
cycle.
Getting somewhere.
but the
And it's
spiral
and
is.
it gets, and I agree. I can't say it's designed to get somewhere, but it does get somewhere, right? It's
Yeah.
kind of like the
Everything
cosmos.
changes because of all the input and all the information out there of everything changing everything. The process of the cycle will be the same, but the inputs throughout those changes within the cycle itself
Yeah, and the
will
ontogenic
have to
cycle at
come
some
to a
points,
different place, whether it's
the eu-
ontogenic or
yeah, the
sun going
eukaryotic
to-
cell is, the eukaryotic cell is an input. In another place, the animal is an input to the animal society. In another place, human hunter-gatherer groups are the input to the agro-village. Is
Yeah,
So
and the Earth going around the sun, yes, it goes in a predictable cycle, but really it veers off just a teeny tiny bit each time it goes around, right? I mean, there's
and the sun is moving through space. So
exactly. So
the
things
sun
are
is,
happening. It's not every time there's a cycle. It's not this. That's why it really bugged me to see the definition of a cycle within a lot of network science. The textbook shows to me it's based on graph theory, basically, and it's very to me it's very, a lot of it's very static.
Well,
And-
if you're using flow graphs, where those arrows actually indicate a flow, a dynamic. And the reason in graph theory we call it a cyclical versus acyclical graphs is because if you followed the path of the arrows, you could actually end up back where you started.
Right.
That's the definition of a cyclical graph. An acyclical graph, like a tree, you always go, say, in one direction.
Right. It makes sense. It's just that it's a very limited, it's a very limited model, as where ontogenesis and the engineering cycle are very much the life cycle. A life cycle of anything is always the thing itself, the actual outcome of the cycle changes continually because all is changing. And that's not well in this textbook. It's really not well defined that way.
is that Barabasi, that textbook you're
Yeah.
talking about? Is that
Yeah.
Barabasi?
Yeah, it's a new one. It's a relatively new one.
Well,
I try to use it, and refer to it in
Yeah.
in some of my work, and then I just go, wow, it's so limited. I can't use it.
one of my pet peeves is we talk about models, and I don't think you can understand a system until you combine dynamics, networks, hierarchy, cycles. You have to, it's a whole, and you've got to understand
Exactly.
it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Systems
Gary,
are
you've been trying
complex,
to
so you
say
need
something.
multiple perspectives. Yeah, so we need to start bringing this to a close because I need to go and have dinner. But are we getting somewhere? That's the question. I mean,
Well, Tyler pointed out you need an abstract that's sensible, shall we say.
Mm.
And I pointed out that I think you need to more explicitly talk about the way cycles are normally talked about in dynamical systems, and also make a distinction between a cyclical system and a nonlinear chaotic system. So that, you know, and we can engineer. I was going to show you my strange attractor dynamic for my robot foraging control system. So I was using a strange attractor to control the behavior of this robot. As if you look at it from above, or look at go find a scout ant that's looking for food. They don't just go in a random walk. They don't go in a back and forth walk. They go in a stochastic but general direction walk, and I call that the drunken sailor walk. But it was controlled in the robot by this strange attractor basin. It was really quite cool. So they can be engineered. You can engineer for emergence if you know what you're doing. So do you want a cycle? I set out to get a cycle. I was trying to get a sinusoidal back and forth so that the sensors could be scanning the horizon, as it were. But when I put it into practice, the thing was going like this, and I thought, oh my God, I failed. Until I did some experiments and discovered that the robot actually found more resources.
Wow.
And was able to avoid problems than if it had been a sinusoidal search pattern.
Wow.
That's
Yeah.
fun.
So,
Wow.
yeah, it was cool. Really cool.
Yeah.
I wish I could find that thing. It looks like a donut, but the squiggly lines just, never repeat. Anyhow.
Oh, George. Neat.
Yeah.
So those would
Well-
be my
So
inputs.
I'll make some updates to it based on what I've recorded and heard, yeah, as best I can. But I really would like you to help me to improve the material, yeah, because I don't want this to be me doing it on my own, yeah.
You want to put it up on Google Docs and we can just comment on it then?
Yeah,
Put it on Google Docs and
Yeah.
share. Then
I really do need to believe that this is worthwhile doing, because if I don't believe it, then I won't do it.
well,
Honestly.
trust
yeah.
me, cycles is the toughest
Yeah,
one to
and-
start with.
and-
It's just
Yeah.
it's a tough one.
If
It is.
If we can't,
I'm glad you're doing it because
Yeah.
then I can do it. This is a little,
but
it's like, it's a tough one.
It's tough in that in 2 pages. That's the issue, Gary. I mean, I had a chapter on it. As I reread it, it could be a book, but then it's going to take me years because it's such a. And so I think you can do it in 2 pages if it's really clear what the bounds, what the aims of it are.
yeah, and that's why the abstract's so important.
Yeah, and you have to do that. I mean, the Google Docs thing is just going to, at least for me, lead me into like nests of complexity of things. If we can agree on an abstract, then what you put in there is the examples to show, because it's not going to be complete. It's not like doing every cycle. The logical level is not claiming to be the 6 subtypes of cycles.
No.
It's an example of what we could do.
It's the meta.
It's the meta.
Mm.
And so that has to be clear, and I think you have to take a stab at that. I'm happy to edit it, but I can't write the abstract right now
Yeah,
because
sure,
it's
I get
not
that.
yeah.
Since this is a wiki, also we need to think in terms of hyperlinks to pages that are going to, like, what's the next couple of pages that you want to do, and then so we can basically make this into a hyperlinked wiki network.
Yeah.
So this first exercise will format your next
Yeah.
and make it a
Oh,
lot easier. It's much harder to do the first one.
Mm,
Much harder.
okay.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Got lively. George, I'm looking up the Foragers to Farmers book because I read Ian Morris's Why the West Rules. So I was
Yes, that was the other. Yeah.
pretty impressed with that.
I
Yeah.
ordered it. Every time I walk away from this, I spend money. You know? And I always go through, I hate it because I always go through, should I get the Kindle or should I get the hardcover, you know, or the soft cover? And shoot, you know, I like the book
yeah,
in my hand. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
me too.
there's no
I like the
substitute.
book in my hand. So my
Yeah.
book
Which cost you twice as much. To have the.
or not necessarily, which is annoying. But I would like to have both because electronically, then I can just
Yes.
pull stuff out. It's annoying to buy the hardcover and not have some kind of system where you can also have the electronic for a couple more dollars.
Yeah.
Well,
Because, yeah,
Oh.
my textbook with Mike Halton is that way. You can buy individual chapters, Kindle version.
really,
Oh yeah, and the Kindle version of the whole book has got all those links
yeah.
buried in it. So
So Gary, when do we start making money from